So I'm going to go over naming different kinds of compounds. So we're going to look at ionic and covalent together because really that's the trickiest bit. So when we are looking at these compounds, the very first thing we have to ask ourselves is my compound ionic or is it molecular? Which is just a fancy way of saying covalent. Okay, now, really what we have to ask ourselves is, do we have two nonmetals, in which case it's covalent, or a metal and a nonmetal, in which case it's ionic? And remember, your periodic table has this handy stair-step line that separates the metals from the nonmetals. So to the left are the metals, to the right are the nonmetals. Okay, so if it has two nonmetals, it's covalent. And that's when we're going to use those prefixes like mono, di, tri, etc. So let's look at an example. Let's say that I had P2F3. I would look at that and I would say, nonmetal, nonmetal, so this must be covalent. Sometimes it helps to like write a little C or an I next to them just to help getting you using the right set of rules. All right, so I'm going to use my prefixes. So this is diphosphorus, trifluoride, because there's two phosphoruses and three fluorines. Okay. Now, if it's ionic, so it contains both a metal and a nonmetal, then I have to ask myself another question, which is, does the compound contain a transition metal? If the answer is yes, that's when I have to use those Roman numerals. If the answer is no, I'm simply going to write the name of the cation and then the anion plus the suffix "ide." So let me give you two different examples there. Let's say that I had magnesium and nitrogen, and that I had nickel and fluorine. Okay. When I look at this first one, going through the flow chart, I would say, okay, is it ionic or molecular? Well, it has a metal and a nonmetal, so it must be ionic. Now, does the compound contain a transition metal? Well, magnesium is not a transition metal. And also, this is more broadly, does it have multiple oxidation states? But transition metals are kind of just a convenient thing to look at, okay? Is not a transition metal. It does not have multiple oxidation states. So all I have to do to name this then is write the name of the cation and then the anion plus the suffix "ide." So this would simply be called magnesium nitride. Now, when I look at the next example, again, it has a metal and a nonmetal, so it's ionic, but it does contain a transition metal. So I'm going to have to use a Roman numeral in here. Now, one of the most common mistakes people make is that they're not really sure what that Roman numeral represents or how to find it. So this Roman numeral that's going to go in here represents the charge on the metal. Okay? Think about it as like you're giving someone instructions so that if they read that formula later, they would, or if they read that name later, they would know how to write the formula. Okay? Since nickel has multiple charges, unless you say that which charge it is in the name, somebody else looking at your answer wouldn't know. So nickel is combined with two fluorines. Now, nickel's charge is unknown right now, but I do know fluorines. I know that fluorine will gain one electron to form a fluoride ion, and so that way it'll have a noble gas configuration. So if one nickel balances out two fluorines, nickel's charge must be +2. So this is nickel 2 fluoride. All right, I'm going to show 3 examples, one of each, and we're going to go through this flowchart process one more time. All right, so let's take a look at these. So the first one, is it ionic or covalent? That's the first question I always have to ask. Sulfur and oxygen are both nonmetals to the right of that stair-step line, which means that it's covalent. So now I'm going to use those prefixes. Now remember, I don't use mono on the first word. So this would just be sulfur dioxide. Okay. Now for the next one, chromium and phosphorus. Okay. Chromium is here and phosphorus is over here. So I have a metal and a nonmetal. So that means that I now have to ask if I have a transition metal. And chromium is in fact a transition metal with multiple oxidation states. So it's going to be chromium something phosphide. To figure out what that is, I can look at the two charges. So I have one chromium and one phosphorus. Phosphorus, when it forms an ion, gains 3 electrons. So its charge will be -3. So what does chromium have to be to balance that out? +3. So this is chromium 3 phosphide. The last one, sodium and oxygen. Sodium is here and oxygen is here. So we have a metal and a nonmetal, so it is ionic. Does it contain a transition metal? No. We know sodium is always +1. So when we write its name, we can just write sodium oxide. The only way this gets easier, quite honestly, is with a lot of practice. So take the time, make sure you're doing the homework, make sure that you're asking lots of questions, and it will get easier the more you practice it.